On May 31, 2026, Caroline Kennedy stood at a podium inside her father's presidential library and paused. It was the smallest hesitation, barely a breath, but those who knew anything about this woman understood exactly what it cost. Then she said what she had come to say. Most of all, we remember Tatiana. The room went silent before it applauded, and the applause lasted nearly 20 seconds. Caroline collected herself quietly, said thank you into the microphone, waited, and went on. She did not break. She said what she came to say and she sat down. More than 650 people were in that room, and not one of them was applauding a speech. They were applauding the fact of her continued standing. That is the sentence around which Caroline Kennedy's entire life organizes itself, not just Tatiana's devastating apology from her New Yorker essay, though that sentence matters enormously, but this one, quieter and more terrible, she was still standing. 5 months after burying her child. In her father's library. Saying her daughter's name. Most people understand grief as something that happens and then, in time, recedes. A season of mourning that gives way, slowly and imperfectly, to the resumption of ordinary life. Caroline Kennedy has never known grief that way. For her, loss is not a chapter in a life otherwise defined by other things. It is the structure of the house itself. It is what the walls are made of, what the foundation sits on, what the roof is built from. It is not something she carries. It is something she lives inside. She was 5 years old on November 22, 1963, when her father was shot in a motorcade in Dallas, Texas. 5 days from her 6th birthday. Her brother John was 3. Their mother, Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy, was 34 years old and became a widow in the back of a car, in the Texas sunlight, before the world's watching eyes. The photographs that followed entered the American imagination so completely that they became something other than photographs. They became mythology. Caroline in her white coat at the funeral, holding her mother's hand. The small boy at the graveside, saluting. These images have been reproduced so many thousands of times across so many decades that it is easy to forget what they actually were. Pictures of children in shock. Real children, living real consequences, performing the outward forms of grief on the largest stage the modern world had yet produced. The world watched and called it grace. What it actually was two small people learning in public that the world had changed forever and that the change was permanent and that there was nothing to be done about it except to hold still. What it means to lose a father at 5 years old. Caroline Kennedy has addressed this over the decades with a measured and deliberate honesty that is, in its own quiet way, an act of sustained courage. She has spoken of growing up knowing her father was gone, knowing the entire world shared in the mourning, knowing that her family's name carried a gravitational weight that nothing in childhood had equipped her to bear. She has described her mother's careful stewardship of JFK's legacy, the photographs on the walls, the stories told and retold, the deliberate and relentless preservation of a man her children would only ever know secondhand, as something that was simultaneously a profound gift and a kind of beautiful suffocation. She was her father's daughter in a country that would never allow her to be simply herself, not even in the years when that was the only thing she wanted to be. Her childhood after Dallas was grief performed inside a fishbowl. The world watched and assigned meaning to everything it saw. Inside the fishbowl were a little girl and her younger brother, learning to live with an absence that the world had decided was also its own, and that the world therefore felt entitled to observe indefinitely. Jackie moved the family first to Georgetown, then to New York City, trying to construct something resembling a normal childhood around two of the most watched children in the world. She hired tutors. She chose private schools carefully. She held the press at a distance through sheer force of will and the absolute clarity of her own convictions about what her children deserved, and that discipline was itself a form of heroism that Caroline would spend a lifetime studying and eventually inhabiting as her own. The deaths continued on a schedule that seems, in retrospect, almost biblical in its regularity. Her grandfather, Joseph Kennedy Sr., died in 1969. That same year, her uncle Ted Kennedy survived the accident at Chappaquiddick, an event that did not take a life from Caroline directly, but that reshaped the public existence of the Kennedy family in ways that would reverberate for decades, altering the political trajectory of the name she carried, complicating in new ways what it meant to be a Kennedy in America. In 1975, Aristotle Onassis died. He had been a stabilizing presence in Jackie's life, and whatever complicated feelings the marriage had produced in her children, his absence left Jackie diminished in ways that were visible to those who loved her. But the deaths that carved Caroline Kennedy most deeply came later, when she was already an adult, already a mother herself, and therefore fully capable of understanding exactly what each one meant, not just emotionally, but structurally. Not just as a loss of a person but as a loss of what that person held together. In January of 1994, her mother Jackie was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. She was dead by May. She was 64 years old. For Caroline, who had spent her entire adult life in the gravitational field of her mother's particular kind of strength, quiet, fierce, private, absolutely unwilling to perform vulnerability for public consumption, the loss was immeasurable in the most literal sense. There was no way to measure it, because Jackie had been the unit of measurement. She had been the person who made the decisions alone in the days after Dallas, in the back of Air Force One, still wearing the pink suit with her husband's blood on it, who decided with iron clarity how her children would understand their father's death and what the days that followed would look like. She had been the person who kept what remained of the family from coming apart across 2 decades of subsequent grief. She had been, in every meaningful sense, the anchor. When the anchor is gone, the drifting is not metaphorical. It is structural. Caroline was 36 years old when her mother died. She had been married to Edwin Schlossberg since 1986, a wedding at the Kenedy family compound on Cape Cod, a wedding Jackie had lived to attend, which in retrospect was its own kind of grace. Ed Schlossberg was a designer and artist, a man of genuine intellectual substance whose calm has been described by those who know the family as a steadying force in a household that had reasons to be unsteady. Caroline had 3 children, Rose, born in 1988, Tatiana, born in 1990, and John, called Jack, born in 1993. She was building a life, and the foundation was gone. It would be both easy and wrong to reduce Caroline Kennedy to a catalog of what has been taken from her. She is also a person who built something, deliberately and with genuine seriousness, from the material that was given to her, which included not only grief but also intelligence, discipline, and the particular clarity of someone who has spent a lifetime understanding what actually matters and what does not. She attended Radcliffe College and Columbia Law School. She worked as a consultant at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where she met her future husband in the early 1980s. She co-wrote a series of books on constitutional law and civil liberties that were not vanity projects bearing a famous name but genuinely useful contributions to the public understanding of American rights. She founded the Profile in Courage Award in 1989, created specifically to honor elected officials who took positions of moral principle at political cost. The virtue her father had written about in Profiles in Courage, the virtue she had been raised to believe was the highest and most demanding form of public service. In 2013, she became the first woman to serve as United States Ambassador to Japan, a role she held until 2017 and in which she was widely regarded as effective, thoughtful, and substantive. From 2022 to 2024, she served as ambassador to Australia. These are not decorative achievements. They are the record of a person who chose, consistently and across decades, to be useful, to do work, to show up. She raised 3 children in New York City who have each become their own distinct people. Rose, who has lived her life largely outside the public eye, Tatiana, who became one of the most rigorous and compelling environmental journalists of her generation, and Jack, who is now running for Congress in Manhattan, carrying the family's instinct for public service into the next generation with a seriousness that suggests it is not merely inherited but genuinely his own. At the Profile in Courage ceremony, after his mother spoke Tatiana's name and the room applauded and went quiet, Jack stepped to the microphone to introduce Jerome Powell and said, "Thank you to my amazing mother. She has taught me how to handle life's challenges with grace and determination." He said it simply, without elaboration. He did not need to elaborate. The room knew exactly what he meant. But before all of that, before the ambassadorships and the awards ceremonies and the quiet, ongoing work of a public life, there was another death. the one that made Caroline the last. John Kennedy Jr. had been, since before he was old enough to understand it, one of the most famous people in America. He was the little boy in the photograph, the boy who saluted, grown into a man of genuine charisma and intelligence who carried the weight of a national myth in a way that could easily have destroyed him and somehow did not, or at least had not yet. He had founded George magazine. He had married Carolyn Bessette in 1996 in a ceremony so carefully concealed that it actually remained secret, which was an almost unimaginable achievement for two people whose combined visibility was nearly total. On the night of July 16, 1999, John was piloting a small plane from New Jersey toward Martha's Vineyard. With him were his wife Carolyn and her sister Lauren Bessette. The weather over the Atlantic was hazy and the visibility poor. Somewhere over the water, the plane entered a steep descending spiral. The Coast Guard searched for 16 hours. The bodies were recovered 3 days later. John was 38 years old. Carolyn was 33. Lauren was 34. Caroline had been close to her brother in the specific way that is only available to two people who have shared something no one else in the world can share, the particular texture of that childhood, that name, that fishbowl, that loss. They had grown up together inside the careful construction their mother had built around their father's memory. They had been each other's only possible company in the deepest rooms of their shared experience, because there was no one else alive who had lived those rooms the same way. The death of one of them haved something in the other that had no name and could not be restored, because the thing it haved was not love. Love can survive loss, but witness. The person who had been there for all of it, who had seen what she had seen and known what she had known from the very beginning, was gone. She was the last surviving child of Jack and Jackie Kenedy. At 31, she had lost her father. At 36, her mother. At 41, she lost her brother, his wife, and her sister-in-law in a single night over the Atlantic Ocean. She has said almost nothing publicly about what those losses did to her. Not because she lacks the language, but because some things have never belonged to the public, and Caroline Kenedy has always known precisely where that line falls, has known it since childhood, was taught it by the most disciplined private person she ever knew, has defended it with the same iron will that kept the press from her children's school gates. Tatiana Kennedy Schlossberg was born on May 5, 1990, into a family that understood from the beginning that it was not ordinary. She grew up in New York City, attended private school, graduated from Yale, and chose to make herself useful in the particular way that suited her, as an environmental journalist for the New York Times, and then as the author of Inconspicuous Consumption, a book about the hidden environmental costs of the choices people make every day. A book that won the Society of Environmental Journalists Rachel Carson Environment Book Award, and that was, by every account, serious, rigorous, and written with the controlled intelligence of someone who had thought deeply about her subject and cared about it in a way that went beyond professional obligation. She married her college sweetheart, George Moran, in 2017 at the Kennedy family property on Martha's Vineyard, the same property where her parents had married, where her Uncle John had once moved through the world with his easy, famous grace, where the Kennedy family has always gathered to be its complicated self away from as many cameras as possible. George became a physician, a urology resident at Columbia Presbyterian. They had 2 children, Edwin, born in 2022, and Josephine, born on May 25, 2024. On the morning of Josephine's birth, a few hours after she arrived, a routine blood test showed an anomaly. An elevated white blood cell count, 131,000 cells per microliter, against a normal range of 4 to 11,000. More tests. The diagnosis arrived with the specific cruelty reserved for moments that are supposed to be their opposite. Acute myeloid leukemia, with a rare mutation called inversion 3. The day her daughter was born, Tatiana's parents had brought her 2-year-old son to the hospital to meet his sister. Instead, Tatiana was moved to another floor. Her daughter was carried off to the nursery. Her son wanted to stay and drive the hospital bed like a bus. She said goodbye to her parents and her son and was wheeled away. She had swum a mile in the pool the day before, 9 months pregnant. She was one of the healthiest people she knew. What followed was 18 months of the kind of treatment that requires a person to decide, repeatedly and at great cost, to keep going. Rounds of chemotherapy. A bone marrow transplant using her sister Rose's stem cells. Remission. Relapse. A second round of chemotherapy, stronger. A clinical trial of CAR T-cell therapy. Cytokine release syndrome. A storm of inflammation that left her unable to breathe without high-flow oxygen, her lungs filling with fluid, her liver compromised, her body on the brink of the ICU. Remission again. A second transplant, this time using cells from an unrelated donor in his 20s from the Pacific Northwest. A Seattle tech worker or a Portland woodcutter, she imagined, someone she could never thank properly. Remission again. Relapse again. More hospitalizations. Weeks she would later say she did not remember. She lost 30 pounds. She learned to walk again. She couldn't lift her children. Her doctor told her he could keep her alive for a year, maybe. She wrote about all of it in The New Yorker in November of 2025, in an essay called A Battle with My Blood, that was published on November 22nd, the 62nd anniversary of her grandfather's assassination, a date the Kennedy family has spent 6 decades learning to carry and never quite succeeding in putting down. The essay was an act of extraordinary precision and courage. She wrote about the diagnosis and the specific surreal experience of receiving a terminal prognosis as a young mother, of not being able to believe that this was her life, of deciding that the only way through the disbelief was to find the humor in it and hold on. She described calling herself a busted-up Voldemort when she was bald and bruised. She described her son visiting her in the hospital and wanting to drive her bed like a bus and sitting on the floor of the Skyway with her even when she wasn't supposed to leave her room. She described her daughter, Josephine, her curly red hair like a flame, stomping around in yellow rain boots with fake pearls around her neck and no pants, picking up a portable speaker and saying, "Baby, baby," to request James Brown, and the unbearable particular grief of knowing she would not be there to see who this child became. She wrote about her husband George, who slept on the floor of the hospital, who talked to every doctor and insurance person she couldn't face, who came back after putting the children to bed to bring her dinner, who did not get angry when, steroid raging, she screamed at him that she didn't like Schweppes ginger ale, only Canada Dry. She wrote, "I feel so cheated and so sad that I don't get to keep living the wonderful life I had with this kind, funny, handsome genius I managed to find." She wrote about climate change, the professional preoccupation of her career, the subject she had given her working life to, and the particular, almost vertiginous grief of caring about the future of a planet she knew she would not be present for. She wrote about the discovery that one of her chemotherapy drugs, cytarabine, owed its existence to a Caribbean sea sponge, and about the government research funding that had made that discovery possible, the funding that her cousin was now cutting. She wrote that she had planned to write a book about the oceans, their destruction and their possibilities. She would not write it now. She wrote about her cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr., confirmed as Secretary of Health and Human Services while she watched from her hospital bed, and she wrote about it with the specific controlled fury of someone who has earned the right to be angry and who chooses precision over volume. She described watching him cut nearly $500 million for mRNA vaccine research, technology that could be used against cancers like hers. She described his cuts to the NIH, the cancellation of clinical trials that were other patients' only chances, the threat to the panel of experts responsible for recommending cancer screenings. She noted that early in her illness, a dose of misoprostol, a drug under review at RFK Jr.'s urging, had helped stop a postpartum hemorrhage that might otherwise have killed her. "I freeze," she wrote, "when I think about what would have happened if it had not been immediately available to me." And then she wrote about her mother. "For my whole life, I have tried to be good, to be a good student and a good sister and a good daughter, and to protect my mother and never make her upset or angry. Now I have added a new tragedy to her life, to our family's life, and there's nothing I can do to stop it." A daughter dying, apologizing to her mother for dying. That sentence stopped everyone who read it, not because it was surprising. Anyone who understood anything about Caroline Kennedy and the losses she had already survived would understand immediately why a daughter would write that sentence, but because it was so precisely, so devastatingly true. The weight Tatiana was carrying was not just her own death. It was the knowledge of what her death would do to a woman who had already buried a father, a mother, a brother, a sister-in-law, and more. It was the knowledge that she was adding to an architecture of grief that was already almost too heavy to stand under, and that she could do nothing to stop it. She was 35 years old and she was apologizing for being mortal in a family that could not afford any more mortality. She died on December 30th, 2025. Caroline and Ed did not retreat. In the months that followed Tatiana's death, they moved into the home that Tatiana and George had shared to help raise Edwin and Josephine, 4 years old and 2 years old enough to know that the center of their world has shifted, too young to understand what shifted or why or whether it will ever shift back. Caroline Kenedy, 68 years old, grandmother to a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old who need her in the most immediate and concrete possible way, became in some sense a second mother to children who will grow up knowing their grandmother in a way that their mother cannot be known, in person, daily, present in the yellow rain boot mornings and the bedtime stories and the ordinary unremarkable accumulation of days that is the only real antidote to the kind of loss that cannot otherwise be remedied. Jack Schlossberg said that he talks to his late sister every day. He said that heartbreak doesn't begin to capture the sadness. He said, "She was so smart and so funny, just like her mom. She was so thoughtful and so brilliant, just like her dad." He said it about Tatiana. He meant it about Caroline. Whether he intended the double meaning or not, it was precise. Smart and funny. Thoughtful and brilliant. Present, when presence requires an act of will. At the ceremony on May 31st, 2026, Caroline introduced the award winners with the full force of someone who has earned the right to speak about courage from a position that is not theoretical. She spoke about Jerome Powell, who had protected the independence of the Federal Reserve through years of personal attacks and the threat of criminal prosecution. She spoke about the people of Minneapolis and St. Paul, who had organized and mobilized and refused to be terrorized when 3,000 armed federal agents moved into their communities. She memorialized Renee Good and Alex Preddy, 2 Minneapolis residents and American citizens who had died in the protests and whose family members were in the room. She gave the full speech. She did her job. And before all of it, she said Tatiana's name. Kenedy historian Stephen Gillen has said that when you consider the full inventory of what Caroline Kenedy has lost, it was only her brother John who had ever known the same depth of it, and then she lost John too. What that leaves is a person who has been living for most of her life in a territory that no map covers, because no map was ever made for it. The particular loneliness of being the last one who remembers what it was like from the very beginning. The discipline of public composure has never been, in her case, a refusal to feel. It is the inheritance her mother left her, more durable than money or property or the weight of a name, the understanding that you can survive the unsurvivable and that how you survive it matters. That the world is watching and has always been watching and will always be watching, and that what it sees when it looks at you is either a testimony to something or a collapse, and that the choice between those two things is yours to make, every time, even when making it costs everything you have. She has been making that choice since she was 5 years old, standing at a graveside in a white coat, holding her mother's hand. She is making it still. And somewhere in a New York City apartment, a 4-year-old boy is driving a toy bus and a 2-year-old girl in yellow rain boots is asking for James Brown, and their grandmother is in the next room, and she is present, and she is paying whatever it costs to be present, and she will keep paying it for as long as she is asked. That is the most Caroline Kenedy thing she could do. It is the only thing she has ever known how to do. She does it every day.